Is what you know about South African colonization the whole truth, or just a fraction of it? This is a question that begs a second look at the history we've been told. The colonization of South Africa is a tale overflowing with significant events, profound impacts, and far-reaching consequences. Yet, there are untold stories, hidden truths, and submerged narratives waiting to be explored. Prepare to challenge your understanding as we delve into the untold story of South African colonization. Before the Dutch and the British, there were the Portuguese. Now, let's journey back to the late 15th century, when the Portuguese explorers Bartolomé Dias and Vasco da Gama first made their initial contact with the South African coast. Their motivations? The pursuit of new trade routes to India and the East, driven by the allure of spices, silks, and other exotic goods. But in the process, they charted a course that would forever alter the trajectory of South African history. Dias, the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope, opened up a new maritime route, while da Gama's successful expedition to India established a sea link between Europe and Asia. These journeys were not without their challenges, marked by treacherous seas and unfamiliar territories. Yet their voyages sowed the seeds for future European interactions with South Africa. These Portuguese explorers paved the way for the colonization that was to come. 1652 marked the arrival of the Dutch East India Company in the Cape of Good Hope. This was a significant year, not just for the Dutch, but for the course of South African history as we know it. It was in this year that Jan van Riebeeck, an ambitious Dutch merchant, established a supply station on behalf of the Dutch East India Company. This was not a colony in the traditional sense, but a strategic stopover for Dutch ships en route to the East Indies. The location was the Cape of Good Hope, a name that resonated with the aspirations of these European settlers. Here they hoped to grow fresh produce to replenish their ships, a need that was crucial for their long sea voyages. This necessity led to the establishment of the Cape Colony, the first European settlement in South Africa. But this land was not empty. It was home to the Khoikhoi and San peoples, indigenous communities with rich histories and cultures that span thousands of years. The arrival of the Dutch brought them into contact with these communities, a meeting of worlds that would forever change the trajectory of their lives. The Dutch, with their advanced technology and different ways of life, initially traded with the Khoikhoi, but as their settlement grew, so did their demand for land and resources. This led to conflicts and tensions with the Khoikhoi and San, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the history of South African colonization. The Dutch also brought with them their language, religion, and cultural practices, introducing a new way of life that would significantly influence the region. These cultural impositions marked the beginning of a process of assimilation and displacement for the indigenous peoples. The Dutch East India Company's arrival in 1652 was more than just the establishment of a supply station. It was the beginning of a new era in South African history, an era of colonization, cultural clashes, and profound changes that would shape the future of this diverse land. The Dutch had firmly planted their roots, but as history would have it, they weren't alone for long. The Napoleonic Wars brought a new player onto the South African stage, the British. The British Empire, an ever-expanding global power, had its eyes set on South Africa during the tumultuous times of the Napoleonic Wars. The Cape of Good Hope, a strategic maritime route, was too enticing to ignore. So, in the early 19th century, during the heat of the Napoleonic Wars, the British swooped in and took occupation of the Cape. This occupation wasn't just a fleeting moment in history. It marked the beginning of a new era in South Africa's narrative. The Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814 formalized British control over the Cape. The Dutch, who had first established a supply station at this strategic point, had to step aside as the British officially took over. The Cape was more than just a strategic location for the British. It was a gateway to the wealth of the East and a buffer against French expansion. The British were well aware of the importance of controlling this maritime route and were determined to secure their hold on it. The Cape was now under British control, and so the landscape of South Africa was about to change. The British takeover wasn't without its share of conflicts. The indigenous peoples, the Dutch settlers, and the British authorities were all players in a complex power struggle. The British rule brought with it new laws, new systems, and new conflicts. The tensions between the British and the Dutch settlers would eventually escalate into the Anglo-Boer Wars, a series of conflicts that would shape the future of South Africa. The British rule was a turning point in South Africa's history. Their strategic occupation of the Cape during the Napoleonic Wars marked the beginning of a new chapter. The British had taken the stage, and their impact would be felt long after the wars had ended. With the British in control, the landscape of South Africa was about to undergo a dramatic transformation. The British takeover set the stage for the next phase of South Africa's history, a phase marked by conflict, change, and the struggle for control. Colonization brought about profound social, cultural, and economic changes. The indigenous peoples of South Africa, the Khoikhoi, San, and Bantu-speaking communities, bore the brunt of these transformations. Their displacement was vast and far-reaching, as European settlers seized land for agriculture and settlement. This displacement was not merely physical, but also cultural, as these communities were uprooted from their ancestral lands and ways of life. Cultural assimilation followed swiftly on the heels of displacement. The European colonizers imposed their languages, religions, and customs on the indigenous peoples. Languages such as Afrikaans and English became dominant, while indigenous languages were sidelined. The traditional beliefs and practices of the indigenous communities were suppressed, and Christianity was introduced in their place. This imposition of European culture led to a significant loss of indigenous identity and heritage. But the impact of colonization was not just social and cultural, it was also economic. The colonizers exploited the rich natural resources of South Africa, particularly in the mining and agricultural sectors. The discovery of diamonds and gold led to a mining boom, with indigenous peoples being forced to work in harsh and dangerous conditions. Similarly, in agriculture, the fertile lands were taken over by European settlers, and the indigenous peoples were made to work as laborers, often under conditions of servitude. This economic exploitation was underpinned by systemic racial discrimination. The indigenous peoples were seen as inferior and were relegated to the lowest rungs of the social and economic ladder. Their labor was exploited, and they were denied access to the wealth generated by their own land. The indigenous peoples paid a heavy price for colonization, a price that echoes through the generations. Their displacement, cultural assimilation, and economic exploitation have left indelible scars on South Africa's history and continue to shape its present and future. 1910 saw the birth of the Union of South Africa, but what did this union truly represent? A significant milestone, the Union of South Africa, was more than just the unification of British colonies and Boer republics. It was the forging of a nation, an amalgamation of diverse cultures and histories, and a pivotal turning point in the narrative of South Africa's past. The journey towards union began in the late 19th century, with the British victory in the Anglo-Boer Wars. This victory marked the end of Boer independence, and the Transvaal and Orange Free State were annexed by the British Empire. Alongside the Cape Colony and Natal, these territories formed the backbone of what would become the Union of South Africa. But this union was not without its controversies. It was, in essence, a compromise between the British and the Boers, or Afrikaners, as they would later be known. The British agreed to allow the Afrikaners a degree of self-rule, while the Afrikaners accepted British sovereignty. This agreement, however, overlooked the rights and interests of the indigenous African population, setting a precedent for racial segregation policies that would come to define South Africa's 20th century history. The Union of South Africa was officially established on the 31st of May, 1910, under the reign of King George V. The British colonies of the Cape of Good Hope, Natal, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State were brought together as one, with the capital rotating between Cape Town, Pretoria, and Bloemfontein. The newly formed union adopted a constitution that enshrined racial segregation and disenfranchisement. The native African population was largely excluded from political participation, their rights and freedoms curtailed. This laid the groundwork for the infamous system of apartheid, which would cast a long and dark shadow over the country in the years to come. The Union of South Africa marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, setting the stage for the South Africa we know today. South African colonization, a story of exploration, exploitation, and transformation. We've journeyed from the early Portuguese pioneers through the Dutch and British reign, witnessing the profound impacts on indigenous cultures. We've unearthed the hidden narratives of economic exploitation, cultural assimilation, and political change. A history retold, revealing the concealed truths and mysteries of South Africa's past. If you're intrigued by the unconventional, eager to challenge historical norms, and ready to explore the charted, but with a different lens, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.